The Canon R6 Mark I and Mark II are two of the best cameras from Canon right now. Not only do they have class-leading specs, but they're also an amazing value for your money. They do share some similarities because they're both R6 cameras, but the devil is in the details. And there's a few minor differences between these cameras that actually drastically change who these cameras are for. So let's talk about which camera is better, but what are the major differences between these cameras and which one is actually worth it. Also, I'm gonna leave links down below for the best pricing on both cameras. The Canon R6 Mark I has a 20 megapixel full frame sensor, where the R6 Mark II has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor. Both cameras look amazing, and I don't think either camera is going to make you feel like you don't have enough resolution. However, the resolution difference is about 12.2%. But if you're someone like me that likes to go in and touch up every little minute detail in your photos, you may want that extra bit of resolution from the R6 Mark II. But if it's just a sharpness thing, you can simply add about 10 points of sharpness to the R6 Mark I, and you will get equally sharp photos from that 20 megapixel sensor. And my really talented friend Albert actually shoots exclusively with the Canon R6 Mark I, and he has produced some amazing photos, and I don't think you ever look at his photos wishing there was more resolution, because what you really focus on is the artistic vision of his photographs. I personally own the R6 Mark II, and I am someone that likes to go in and touch up every little bit of detail, and I definitely appreciate the 24 megapixel sensor. However, I actually would probably go for a 33 megapixel sensor like the A7 IV or a 45 megapixel sensor in the Canon R5, but the Canon R5 with a 45 megapixel sensor is like $5,000. And both Canon sensors are tremendous in low light as long as you use full stops of ISO at 800, 1600, 3200, all the way up to 12,800. These are surprisingly good in low light, although they're not quite on the same level as the Sony FX3. And just between the Canon R6 Mark I and Mark II, the Mark II is obviously cleaner in low light performance because it is a newer camera. When it comes to photos, on paper, it looks like the Canon R6 Mark II is better because it shoots 12 frames per second in mechanical mode and 40 frames per second in electronic shutter mode, which is just ridiculous in terms of frame rate. And the autofocus is always tack sharp. It's very, very responsive. And the Canon R6 Mark I has 12 frames per second mechanical shutter mode and only 20 frames per second electronic shutter mode. And the autofocus is pretty good, but it does tend to miss now and then. But here's the thing about the R6 Mark I. It actually has a way bigger frame buffer. It can shoot 1,000 JPEGs in a row before this camera needs a break, and 258 raw photos before the camera needs to stop. In comparison, the Canon R6 Mark II shoots 110 frames per second at 12 frames per second, which is the slower shutter speed, and only 75 photos in RAW at the faster 40 frames per second. But the Canon R6 Mark II can still shoot 1,000 JPEGs in mechanical mode at 12 frames per second, but only 190 JPEGs in the electronic shutter mode at 40 frames per second. Okay, I know I just threw a bunch of numbers at you, my bad, but no matter how you slice it, the Canon R6 Mark I is better in some ways because it has a much larger frame buffer. This means you can shoot photos for a longer period of time before this camera needs a break. And this feature is really important if you shoot sports and wildlife where you don't really know where the action is coming from, how long it's gonna take to get there. And this way, this is a much better camera if you're someone that needs to just spray and pray. That sounded dirty, I did not mean it like that. The autofocus in both cameras is pretty great, but the Mark II is definitely more sticky and more reliable as an autofocusing system, and the R6 Mark I does tend to miss sometimes. Now, here's the thing, you're really not going to notice it when you're shooting photos because when this camera takes a photo, it's generally always in focus, so while you will kind of see your autofocus missing here and there, it won't really show up in your photos. But this whole autofocus debate is very different when it comes to video. And video is really where these two cameras tend to differentiate themselves. Both cameras shoot at 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, and the video is also downsampled from the full 6K sensor area. So you will be getting the detail and clarity of 6K in your 4K image. The 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second from both cameras is pretty close to identical. There is a slight difference if you really look hard. The R6 Mark II is slightly sharper with slightly more detail, but you're really not going to notice it unless you're pixel peeping, which I totally support, but I just don't think it's that big of a deal. However, what is a big deal is that the R6 Mark II has a feature that is really, really good for serious video shooters. The R6 Mark II can also record ProRes RAW at 6K up to 60 frames per second using an external Atomos Ninja recorder. Now, if you're someone that has a big project fall into their lap every now and then, instead of running out and renting a cinema camera for $400 to $500 a day, you can actually rent an Atomos Ninja recorder for like $40, $50, and get 6K ProRes RAW from your R6 Mark II. And both cameras can also shoot in the C-Log color space and HDR PQ for 10-bit color. One thing that did surprise me though is that the C-Log in Canon R6 Mark I is C-Log 1 and C-Log 3, whereas the Canon R6 Mark II only has C-Log 3 in it. For me personally, C-Log 3 is fine, but I do know some people that prefer C-Log 1. Now, slow motion is another important feature that you need in your video camera, and the two cameras are again very different when it comes to slow motion frame rates. The big difference that you'll actually see is that the 4K 60 in the R6 Mark I has a 1.6 times crop on it, which means you're only getting about an APS-C or Super 35 image area, and you're also losing about half the megapixels in your sensor. The R6 Mark II gives you 4K 60 uncropped, and it's also downsampled from the full 6K image area. So the R6 Mark II is going to look way better. Now, if you're a video shooter, you know how important it is to have 4K 60 without a crop. Most cameras, I would say like 90% of the cameras out there, if you get 4K 60, it either crops into your sensor or it somehow messes with your autofocus or reduces video quality. But this is one of the few 4K 60 cameras I've ever found that actually gives you solid 4K 60 without having some sort of compromise. Now, one thing we have to talk about is the video autofocusing systems in these cameras. They're pretty similar on the surface, but where it matters, the two autofocus systems are very different. Both the R6 Mark I and R6 Mark II have face and eye detect, plus they're pretty good with subject tracking. However, with the R6 Mark II, you're going to get a much stickier autofocus. It's much more reliable. With the R6 Mark I, it does a really good job. It's not bad by any means, but I did find that it will randomly just lose the face or randomly just start tracking to something else and just randomly just kind of go off on me. This is not that big of an issue when it comes to photos, but when you're shooting video, even the slightest bit of change in your autofocus is very noticeable. And I just found that the R6 Mark II is more consistent and more reliable. With the R6 Mark I would be so upset if I was getting the perfect shot and the autofocus just randomly decided to stop working on me. This is not a camera that I can honestly recommend to video shooters. Now, I have talked to other R6 Mark I users and even Canon R5 users, and they've all said that yes, they have the same issue with their camera, but all of them say that it's never really ruined a shot for them. It's never really like made them not want to use the camera. So I don't think it's the end of the world, but if you're kind enough to watch this video, I do believe in giving you guys all the details possible. So it was something that I did feel like I needed to bring up. And both cameras can also do super slow motion in HD mode. The Canon R6 Mark I does 120 frames per second using the high speed mode, and the Canon R6 Mark II can shoot full HD at 180 and 120 frames per second using the high speed mode. Points to the R6 Mark II. Now, as important as specs and features are in these cameras, even more important is the design, because a camera that isn't designed for what you're shooting is going to give you a very difficult time. For the most part, the two cameras are actually pretty similar, but there's a few issues with the R6 Mark I that really annoy me. The R6 Mark II has a single knob to flip between photo and video mode instantly. The R6 Mark I, however, has photo and video mode on the mode dial, and the two modes are exactly opposite from each other. So to go from photo mode, you have to go, and then back to video mode, it takes a while. The R6 Mark I is, however, about 20 to 30% lighter. It just feels smaller and more nimble in my hands, where the R6 Mark II feels more chunky, but maybe you like that, but it definitely feels like more work to carry around. Otherwise, the button layout and ergonomics on both cameras is pretty much the same. The button layout's the same, the menus are the same, and if you can use one camera, you can use the other camera. And both cameras also have dual SD card slots. They both use the same Canon LPF batteries, which are really, really good. And they both have the same lens mount, the same LCD screen, and a pretty similar viewfinder, which is also very, very good. So for the most part, it really depends on which camera is right for you. And that really depends on what you're shooting and what kind of stuff you're shooting. I would happily recommend the R6 Mark I to primarily photo shooters. I did not feel like the 20 megapixels wasn't enough resolution, and this camera can still create some really beautiful and artistic images. The last thing to consider is that the R6 Mark II right now is about $500 more than the R6 Mark I. This might change in the future, but I don't know if paying an extra $500 is necessarily worth it for a lot of people. If you're a video shooter, most definitely. But if you're a photographer, probably not. So let me know which camera you guys like better, and if you want to make sure you get the best possible pricing on these cameras, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.